Behavioral Neuroscience, Chapter 2, Segment 3, Developmental Subdivisions of the Brain. These include a neural tube, which is an embryonic structure with subdivisions that correspond to the future forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. A few weeks after conception, the neural tube begins to show three separate swellings at the head end. This is the forebrain, or prosencephalon, the anterior division of the brain that contains the cerebral hemispheres, thalamus and hypothalamus, the midbrain, or the mesencephalon, which is the middle division of the brain, and the hindbrain, the rhombencephalon, which is the rear division of the brain, which in the mature vertebrae contains the cerebellum, pons, and medulla. About 50 days after conception, the forebrain and the hindbrain have already developed clear subdivisions. This includes the telencephalon, which is the frontal subdivision of the forebrain that includes the cerebral hemispheres when fully developed. This consists of the cortex, some deeper structures belonging to two functionally related groups, the basal ganglia and the limbic system. The second division is the diencephalon, which is the posterior part of the forebrain, which includes the thalamus and hypothalamus. The hindbrain further develops into several principal structures, including the metacephalon, which is a subdivision of the brain that contains the cerebellum, or little brain, and pons, which means bridge. The cerebellum is a structure located at the back of the brain, dorsal to the pons, that is involved in the central regulation of movement. The pons is a portion of the metacephalon, which is part of the brainstem connecting to the midbrain to the medulla. The medulla, or the myelencephalon, is the posterior part of the hindbrain, which is continuous with the spinal cord, and the brainstem, which is a region of the brain that consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. Even when the brain achieves its adult form, it is still a fluid-filled tube, but a tube of very complicated shapes. The nucleus is a collection of neurons within the central nervous system, or the CNS. An example would be the caudate nucleus, and a tract, which is a bundle of axons found within the CNS. The brain shows regional specialization of functions. Our brains are bilaterally symmetrical. Most structures of the brain are paired in left and right-sided mirror image versions. Each side of the brain controls the opposite or the contralateral side of the body. The right side controls and receives sensory information from the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain monitors and controls the right side of the body. The cerebral cortex performs complex cognitive processing. The neurons of the cerebral cortex are arranged in 6 distinct layers. The allocortex is cortical tissue with 3 layers or unlayered organizations in contrast with the 6-layered neocortex. A pyramidal cell is the most prominent kind of neuron in the cerebral cortex. It is a type of large nerve cell that has a roughly pyramid-shaped cell body. The apical dendrite is the dendrite that extends from a pyramidal cell to the outermost surface of the cortex. The basal dendrites are one of several dendrites on a pyramidal cell that extend horizontally from the cell body. The cortical columns are perpendicular to the 6 layers, and they serve as information processing units, one of the vertical columns that constitutes the basic organization of the neocortex. Subcortical structures are involved in movement and the regulation of emotions. The basal ganglia, which is a group of forebrain nuclei, including the caudate nucleus, globus pallidus, and putamen, found deep within the cerebral hemispheres. The caudate nucleus is one of the basal ganglia and has a long extension or tail. The substantia nigra is a brainstem structure in humans that innervates the basal ganglia and is named for its dark pigmentation. The limbic system is a loosely defined widespread group of basal brain nuclei that innervate each other to form a network. This is critical for emotion and learning. Parts of the limbic system include the amygdala, which is a group of nuclei in the medial anterior part of the temporal lobe. It has diverse functions including emotional regulation and odor perception. The mammillary body is one of a pair of nuclei at the base of the brain. This contributes to learning and memory. The hippocampus is a medial temporal lobe structure that is important for learning and memory. The fornix is a fiber tract that extends from the hippocampus to the mammillary body. The septal nuclei is a collection of gray matter structures lying medially below the corpus callosum, and it's implicated in the perception of reward. The cingulate gyrus is a cortical portion of the limbic system. It's found in the frontal and parietal midline. The olfactory bulb is an anterior projection of the brain that terminates in the upper nasal passages and through small openings in the skull provides receptors for smell. The stria terminalis is a limbic pathway connecting the amygdala and hypothalamus. It participates in highly motivated behaviors such as sex and threat responses, as well as the integration of hormonal signals. The diencephalon directs sensory information and controls basic physiological functions. The thalamus is a brain region that surrounds the third ventricle. It is a complex cluster of nuclei that acts as a switchbox, directing almost all sensory information to the appropriate regions of the cortex to be processed further. It also receives instructions back from the cortex to control which sensory information is transmitted. The hypothalamus is a part of the diencephalon, which lies ventral to the thalamus. It's packed with discrete nuclei involved in many vital functions like hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, and sex. The midbrain has sensory and motor components. The tectum is the top part of the midbrain, and it includes the inferior and superior colliculi. Visual information is received, and it's also involved in the direction of visual gaze and visual attention to intended stimuli. The inferior colliculi is paired gray matter structures of the dorsal midbrain that receives auditory information. The substantia nigra, which was mentioned earlier, is one of two important motor centers embedded in the midbrain. It contains neurons that release the transmitter dopamine. Loss of this system can lead to Parkinson's disease. The red nucleus is the other motor center. It's a brainstem structure related to motor control. It communicates with motor neurons in the spinal cord. And reticular formation is the extensive region of the brainstem extending from the medulla through the thalamus that is involved in arousal or waking. The cerebellum is attached to the pons and is crucial for motor coordination. The surface of the cerebellum is elaborately convoluted, giving it more surface area. Included in this is Purkinje cells, which is a type of large nerve cells in the cerebral cortex, and granule cells, which are a type of small nerve cells below the Purkinje cells, which rise to form parallel fibers. And the parallel fibers are the outermost layer and one of the axons of the granule cells. The cerebellum is crucial for motor coordination, control, cognition, and learning. The medulla maintains vital basic body functions. It is the most causal portion of the brainstem. It marks the transition from brain to spinal cord. It also contains nuclei that regulate breathing and heart rate. Behaviors and cognitive abilities are determined by functional connections between brain regions. Cortical regions communicate with one another via tracts of axons looping through the underlying white matter. Research at the frontier of neuroscience aims to describe the connectome of the human brain, and international collaborations have been established and aimed at two things, including developing new technologies for probing brain pathways and using available technology to map brain network activity to develop computer simulations of human brain activity. Specialized support systems protect and nourish the brain. The meninges are three protective sheets of tissue, including the dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid, that surround the brain and spinal cord. The dura mater is the outermost of the three meninges, and the pia mater is the innermost of the three meninges. And the arachnoid is a thin covering of the brain that lies between the dura mater and the pia mater. Cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, is fluid that fills the cerebral ventricles. Meningitis is an acute inflammation of the meninges, usually caused by viral or bacterial infection. And meningiomas is several classes of non-cancerous tumors arising from the meninges. The cerebral ventricles are chambers filled with fluid. The ventricular system is a system of fluid-filled cavities inside the brain. It's filled with CSF. The CSF circulating through the ventricular system has at least two main functions. These include that it acts mechanically as a shock absorber for the brain, and it provides a medium for the exchange of materials, including nutrients between blood vessels and brain tissue. Each hemisphere of the brain contains a lateral ventricle, which is a complexly shaped lateral portion of the ventricular system within each hemisphere of the brain. The choroid plexus lines lateral ventricles in its specialized membrane. It's a highly vascular portion of the lining of the ventricles that secretes the cerebrospinal fluid. The third ventricle is the midline ventricle that conducts CSF from the lateral ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle is a passageway within the pons that receives CSF from the third ventricle and releases it to surround the brain and spinal cord. And the brain has an elaborate vascular system. This includes carotid arteries, which are major arteries that ascend the left and right sides of the neck to the brain and supplies blood to the anterior and middle cerebral arteries. The anterior cerebral arteries are two large arteries arising from the internal carotid arteries that provide blood to the anterior poles and medial surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres. The middle cerebral arteries are two large arteries which arise from the internal carotid arteries and provide blood to most of the lateral surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres. The posterior cerebral arteries are two large arteries that arise from the basilar artery that provide blood to posterior aspects of the cerebral hemispheres, cerebellum, and brainstem. Vertebral arteries are arteries that ascend the vertebrae and enter the base of the skull. They join together to form the basilar artery. And the basilar artery is formed by the fusion of the vertebral arteries and supplies blood to the brainstem and to the posterior cerebral arteries. The circle of Willis is a vascular structure at the base of the brain that is formed by the joining of the carotid and basilar arteries. A stroke causes damage to the region of the brain tissue that results from blockage or rupture of vessels that supply blood to that region. And finally, a blood-brain barrier, which is a mechanism that makes the movement of substances from blood vessels into brain cells more difficult than exchanges in other body organs, thus affording the brain greater protection from exposure to some substances found in the blood.